Welcome back.
Welcome to Decision Space, the only show to take place right here, in the space between the turns in your favorite games. I'm Brendan Hansen.
I'm Jake Friedman.
And this is the podcast about decisions in games.
And today we're going to be talking about an important topic in board games, something that perhaps we overlooked by not talking about thus far in our podcasting journey. And the topic today is rules. So this will be our What We Talk About episode on rules. And the reason this came across our desk is because Brendan has had his nose in a book. And that book is called The Rule Book, The Building Blocks of Play by Jaco Stenros and Marcus Montola. And as I understand it, this book has had a ton of really interesting insights that Brendan wants to share with me. So he's going to be talking to me about what he's learning about this book. We're going to have a discussion about that, and we're going to share that conversation with you.
Cool. I'm really excited to dive into it, Jake. Within the book, Jaco Stenros and Marcus Montola really lay out these sort of 5 types of rules that govern games. And I would say that they zoom out about maybe further than we even do. And we've been, we zoom out pretty far sometimes in terms of talking about games. So we're going to talk about the rules within games, the rules around games socially, and then we might even talk about rules that impact the types of rules that we can make in games, which I think will be interesting to see where that goes. And if you're a listener who likes to play a game, pause the episode, think about what the rules might be that dictate the rules that we can make in real life games, and see if you're right once we get to that part of the show.
I love it. But before we get into that conversation, I just want to really quickly share with our listeners one thing we love to do always when we get a nice review. We like to read it out on the podcast, and we got a really nice review. I think people are trying to outdo each other, and this review might be slightly over the top in its kindness, but it is so incredibly sweet. I can't wait to share it.
Before you do, Jake, have you printed this out and framed it yet?
Not yet. But...
Okay, it's on my wall right here.
All right, so here's the review. It's titled Strong NPR Effect, and it goes like this. You're listening to this podcast on your commute. You pull into your parking space. You should make dinner. You should greet your family. You should change into some PJs. You have a lot of you shoulds, but you stay in your vehicle listening. That's the NPR effect. And Decision Space has me full on addicted, NPR affecting every time listen. Decision Space features dynamic and well-spoken hosts who aren't merely game enthusiasts, though their enthusiasm for games shines in the podcast. They are players who understand games from the perspective of a game's mechanisms, as designers themselves, and as highly analytical players who don't simply analyze their next turn, but the game itself. Decision Space has many different episode types, which mixes things up nicely. Some of my favorites are the art awards, designer features, and single game deep dives. I've listened to both their Feld feature episode and their Bonfire episode after acquiring Bonfire. I even re-listened to the Bonfire episode after playing it. The episode got me hyped up to play the game, but also helped me to feel like I was connecting with others through a shared experience of this game, since Brendan and I both broke the game by running out of actions before the game ended.
Let's go.
I love that Jake and Brendan are not afraid to disagree with each other, nor are they bullheaded know-it-alls. Each of them are open to revising their claims throughout their discussion in light of new information and points of view. They have the minds and attitudes of philosophers. Their intellectual stature might suggest they are untouchables of the gaming community, but after joining their off-pod discussion group, our Discord, I was welcomed warmly by Jake himself. All that's left is to coin a new phrase for the endlessly analyzing every nuanced aspect of board games, the decision space effect.
Oh, that's a very, very, very kind review. I think that if you've actually sat in your car and continued to listen to our show when you could be putting pajamas on, that is about as good as it gets. So thank you for that review. That was just lovely. I can also say both Jake and I shared that with our wives.
Yeah. They're like, what do you spend so much time on this podcast? Why? It's like, look,
someone cares.
We're connecting. Yeah. No, genuinely. We're making light of it, but it was so heartwarming to read that, and makes us feel great that we're connecting with people through this show. So thanks for leaving it. And as always, encourage others to leave us reviews as well to help us grow the show and just let us know that we're connecting with folks out there.
So now We're going to talk about the 5 types of rules in games, at least according to Jaco Sternos and Marcus Montola in their book, The Rule Book, The Building Blocks of Play, from MIT Press in the Playful Thinking series, which is a great series of books. So, Jake, this episode is in some ways going to feel, I think, like one of our classic What We Talk About episodes, where we're sort of doing a taxonomy of rules in general. We'll see where we go. This takes us in lots of different directions because it turns out within these 5 types of rules, I think it captures a lot of nuance about the way in which we structure our play, right? Rules at their most basic level are a recipe for structured play that a designer creates and puts into the world for someone to catch. And I think the idea that there's a designer, there's a world, and there's someone catching it is essential to the relationships explored through these 5 types of rules. So there's no more natural place to start, Jake, than formal rules. Formal rules. And we're not going to read excerpts this whole episode, but I think there are essential excerpts that I want to read that will unlock some of the sort of key points of this book for us to then digest on the show. And if Jake disagrees at any point, he can push the eject button and we will no longer read any excerpts. But here we go. Formal rules. This is from the book. Formal rules are not Platonic ideals or mathematical abstractions, but socially constructed articulations of constraints and goals. And to be clear here, formal rules.
That's a lot already.
It's a lot already. Are you pushing eject?
No.
Okay, then I'm going to keep going.
I'm hanging tough.
Okay. They exist on physical paper, right? These are the rules written by a designer and in human mind only because someone created them in some process. They are clear to see in institutional settings such as tournaments, but are also present in everyday casual games. So these formal rules are one of the pillars of these sort of 5 types of rules. These are the rules I think that we most naturally think of when we think of rules. So an example of a formal rule. In Tigris and Euphrates, your score at the end of the game is equal to the color of cube that you have the least of out of the 4 colors. These are the rules of the game.
Right. Okay. Before we get into like specific examples of rules, and I could probably come up with some too.
Okay.
I
bet you could.
Is this formal rules? Right. This is obviously an academic type of book, right?
Yeah.
Seems like in the area of philosophy, right? So there's a need to for the layperson, for the people listening to this podcast, to sort of over-explain, yes, these are things that exist within the earthly plane, right? But okay, so to explain M5, when we're talking about formal rules, are we talking about the rules in the rule book, or is that
for board games? Yes, right. For board games, they are the rules in the rule book.
And what's interesting about that is from a designer perspective, right? That's all you are selling, right? You are, if you're pitching a game to a publisher, all you are presenting them with are the rules, right? This formal rule is sort of like your, I don't know.
It's your product. Yeah. In having my game signed by a publisher, in at least one case, my rule book as submitted was appended to the contract by the publisher to sort of say, this is the document that we are talking about buying from you within this document right here. This is the thing. And I think beyond this, right, there are formal rules not necessarily written down in some games. Rock, paper, scissors has formal rules that we all sort of know, but they exist in our minds. And the designer is, who knows, but we just sort of know the rules of rock, paper, scissors, right? There are 3 different symbols that you can show with your hands. These are the roughly what they are, what they look like. Rock, paper, scissors. There's a relationship defined between them, and then there's rules around how you simultaneously reveal those symbols using some part of your body, or maybe if you're playing with paper, I don't know, you could reveal them. However, sort of it's set up.
I think the example is clear with rock, paper, scissors, right? Like you say, what you say with the rules, right? The rule book of rock, paper, scissors, or what you communicate to other players might be paper beats rock, rock beats scissors, scissors beats paper, and it's 3, 2, 1, shoot. And that's all we need to say to communicate the formal rules of the game. However, there are things that are implied that I didn't just mention, right? that like what we're doing with our hands I didn't explain, but people are just already intuiting what that is. Like the cadence of 3, 2, 1, probably that we're doing like a palm fist onto your palm on the
Mm.
3, 2, 1. You know,
Can I go
to
sideways? Stuff like that.
to make sure we're kind of like getting in the same rhythm and that we're genuinely trying to reveal at the same time or without gaining information by revealing later than another person.
And I think now we're in an interesting part of the conversation because
Yeah.
this kind of we're using an example where the rules haven't actually been written down, but it illustrates this point that there's intended rules, sort of as a thought experiment. Let's say someone designed rock paper scissors, and then brought it to an audience, but they didn't actually write down all the rules. They just sort of said what the rules were. So there's their intent is whatever they thought the game would be in their head. And then there's the codified rules, right? So in board games, the codified rules are whatever actually gets written down and actually gets printed, what is actually printed in the box for people to then take and learn your game from. But that might be different than what the designer actually intended, right? No one is perfect. No publisher is perfect. No designer is perfect. No proofreader is perfect. Mistakes happen. So you might forget to write down a rule that you always teach and you've always taught in every single playtest. And then what actually ends up in the rule book is slightly different. Or maybe a rule gets written slightly differently, and how people interpret that and then read those rules. I think this is an interesting point. Then kind of become the rules, right? There's this really important social moment, right? A designer writes something down, then somehow someone can access it. How someone interprets those rules ends up being sort of the next thing. But the first thing is what's codified, right? There's my intent, and then there's what ends up being put out to the world. And those don't always align.
Right. And as people who listen to this podcast, I'm sure can attest to, right? When you read a rule book, it's almost more likely than not that you'll have some question. There'll be, even if it's not something that was mistaken, there's some opacity between what the rule book says and what actually is the intent of that rule or the way two rules interact with each other. Hence why publishers have facts. Magic the Gathering has errata on cards. Like this card should actually say this if you're using it in a tournament. And there's board game geek threads for how does this card work? For
Yeah.
almost any game you could think of.
And Magic the Gathering, a game where there's hundreds of people working on it all the time, constantly, all year long. They have a whole website and a whole sort of database dedicated to saying, "Oops, we need to change the rules on these cards." They know either no longer align with what we meant, or when we printed it, we didn't actually print it right. Our intent, the intended rule, is different than what was codified. And that's really interesting, right? Because you don't get this necessarily with a I don't know, a mathematical formula or a computer algorithm. And I think sometimes when we think about rules, formal rules of games, we think of them as being these firm structures that are infallibly interpreted or codified when they are written down. And in reality, that's not the case. So I think even in our show, right, we just take for granted. I do a rules overview most of the time when we do a deep dive. But we kind of take for granted, like, the rules. And I take for granted when I sit down and learn the rules from someone that they know the rules. And I also take for granted that the rule book is right, which isn't
Right.
necessarily always the
Or
case.
it's implemented correctly into the digital format, which is interpreting the rule book, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, there's all kinds of ways. The nice thing about the board gaming hobby is that it's often enough to be 98% right.
Yes.
If you mess up something or you're not quite sure about something, the groups I play with are usually pretty cool about saying like, okay, well we've been playing it like this. Let's just keep playing like this and maybe we'll revisit it after the game or we can try and figure out, if we played it right or wrong. But that's genuinely okay. However, it could be the same type of problem could exist in like much more high stakes situations. Magic the Gathering is one potentially, right? Where if somebody realizes a rule actually says one thing, right? And it, where you could have a competitive edge over your opponents based on what the card does, even though it's not supposed to do that because there's a gap in the amount of time between identifying a rule. A card has text that creates, unintended consequences, and the company actually being able to say like that doesn't work like that
Yeah.
anymore. Um, right. Or even higher stakes, right? In like professional sporting events. If American football is like one of the most complicated games ever, teams literally employ lawyers to like look through the rule book to see if they can find edges in exactly that way, where there's some small amount of room between the intent of a rule and the actual letter of the law.
The NFL rulebook is 288 pages long. And I think that helps illustrate, right? Because football, American football is a game played for great stakes in terms of professional well-being and for all these sorts of things where people build their entire lives. Many people structure their whole lives to invest in this game. So it's very important that the codified rules are rock solid. Whatever's written down is exactly what is intended by the game's designers, which in this case is the league. I think at this point, someone invented football, and then the league codified their own interpretation of the rules of football and have then developed the rules further
Right.
in these
Like
codified
Magic the
rules.
Gathering, it's a living document,
Yeah,
right? Where rules won't usually change in the middle of a season, but teams can lobby for rule changes that they would like to be implemented in the next season
yeah.
for player safety or balance of the game in the exact same way we think about board games.
Totally. Okay. I'm so glad you said the way we think about board games. We're veering back to board game space for a minute because I think that there's this relationship, right, between the intended rules and then are what the designer thinks the game is, the game they want to exist in the world. The codified rules are the rules that get written down. But then within this relationship, there's a third person that's really, or a second person that's really important, right? And maybe there's lots of people in the middle, but then there's us, like the players who have to sit down and learn the rules of the game. And maybe that's through reading a rule book, maybe that's watching a video. But when that happens, that's a really important moment in games, right? Where the codified rules then become interpreted rules, right? So we're
We
almost
are the Google translator of this
pretty
situation.
much, we're always
It
playing
comes
telephone with a
The rules
designer's
come into
intent.
our brain
Yep.
and then come out of our brain as play, and they might not be exactly the same.
Exactly the same. Totally. And maybe it's good enough that they match all the time, match close enough, right? But I think that board games are unique, right? When you, for almost, I think a lot of conversations that we've had on the show, there's this sort of social expectation that we are playing a perfect interpretation of the game. And that's important to people, right? They don't want to
Mhm.
hear how we played Samurai, where we got to attack with whatever it was on the board. They want to hear about Samurai as it exists in the codified rules, interpreted perfectly by every player in all of time, even though that's not really a thing that actually exists, right? We've all played the sort of interpreted rules, hopefully as perfectly close to as represented in those codified rules as possible, but it's not always perfect.
It's interesting because so many people feel, I would say, in times that we've had backlash, even feels too strong of a word, but the times that people have like come in to give us some like critical feedback on our podcast have almost always been around like getting a rule wrong.
Sure.
If we say something on this podcast that implies we played a game slightly wrong and then go on to like talk about our feelings about a game, people, that really rubs people wrong. And I understand it, right? Because it's
Yeah.
like, hey, I have a strong connection with this game. Uh,
I'm trying to have a shared
you know,
experience with you.
trying to have a shared experience, and
Yeah.
they're experiencing something different, and especially if it's like not as positive as their experience, like I completely can understand how that would be annoying to listen to.
Yeah.
So it's definitely, all of that to say, I agree with your point. It's definitely something that seems people feel strongly about, holding on to this belief that we are doing things in exactly the right intended way,
Yeah.
at
And
least
it
as often, and we do try as much as possible, of course.
totally. And we'll make mistakes because we are humans interpreting these sort of codified rules, and maybe we're doing it through reading a rule book, or maybe we're doing it through watching a rules video, which is a really normal way to learn
Or
rules,
getting taught the game,
or
right?
getting
That's
taught the
probably a
game.
way it could have, because I don't, if I go to a game night,
Yeah.
some people who attend my Monday night game night will learn the game themselves because we decide we're going to play ahead of time, and we'll always do that. I don't do that.
Yeah.
I'm perfectly happy just to be taught a game and go into it. I really trust everyone to teach the game correctly. But if I get taught the game, then maybe I go buy the game and teach it to somebody else. You could see a really easy way for kind of small rules misunderstanding to be perpetuated
Yeah,
and kind of get out of the
totally.
world that way.
So I think, Jake, within all of this, right, the us maybe misinterpreting a codified rule through our interpreted rules and learning from other people, I think oftentimes on this show, we've broken down into, okay, what is the true rule? What are the true rules of the game, right? Are the true, quote unquote, true rules, whatever that is, the platonic ideal of the rules of this game, the
On
intent, what?
planet Earth,
On
on
planet
planet
Earth?
Earth,
Well, that might come into play
in the
here.
solar system. Okay,
Yeah, yeah.
sorry.
Okay. But are they the designer's intended rules? Are they the codified rules? Or are they the interpreted rules? If every single person reads your codified rules and comes to the same wrong conclusion based on the designer intent, who's right? And I think that where we've often come down is that the designer intent is what matters. And I think reading this chapter of this book on formal rules gave me the epiphany that the real answer, everyone's going to have their own opinion, I think, but is that socially most people want to care about the designer's intent. That's obviously incredibly important, but they want it codified. So if someone says, I heard Antoine Bauza say this just casually, we should play the
Right.
game that way, I think your game group is often going to be like, no, no.
Yeah. No,
But
totally. The
if you're
written word,
yeah,
is
right. So if the same person can say, Jake, I heard Antoine Bauza through a Board Game Geek post in which he published a write up and said, these are the new rules of my game, then I think you get a lot of people and a lot of game groups saying, oh, okay, that's how we should play. Not
yeah,
always, but a lot of people. So, and I think that's where I come down. I want the
yeah.
designer's intent codified because I want my games to be a shared experience. There's something about the fact that I can play a game and you can play a game and we're playing the same game that matters to me in my game playing, even if I never end up talking about that game beyond my game group. Something about
Yeah.
knowing that somewhere else in the world someone's playing this game in that way is important to me as a game player. And I don't have much to say beyond the fact that I find that really interesting, right? As a human, I want my game playing to be a shared experience.
There was that anecdote about Stefan Feld changing the rules in a pretty significant way in Castles of Tuscany,
Okay.
where anyway, there's a few different actions, and one of the actions was like draw two cards, and people, I guess, complained a lot and said that was too weak.
Sure.
So Steffenfeld said, okay, the new rule is draw three cards with that action. And he published that as a tweet on then Twitter, right? And
Oh,
it created
oh,
such a like icky, like, it gave me the ick, right? It was like with the whole game now. And I
yeah.
think part of it is like what you're getting to now. It was like the uncanny valley between sort of like designer intent. Like
Mm,
is that really what he's intending, or is he just like being pressured by people who are like don't like the current rule, and now it's like living here in a tweet, which is then like copied and pasted it, screenshot and put on like Board Game Geek, and now it's like we don't know what the rule is. Like, do
yeah.
I what if I were to play the game right now today? I guess I go with that one.
But would you? What
But
if
like,
someone
am I
said, can
supposed
I
to go
see
like
the rule book?
look up a tweet first or something? Having to go to my phone, right? It's so I think you're right. And the distinctions there are important for sort of like our belief, and having something like clearly delineated like that seems like important for like our belief that like there are rules
Yeah.
that exist.
Yeah. And I think we'll kind of come back to this topic a little bit later when we talk about social rules. But there is this broader question, right? Remember when we read Games Agency as Art and C.T. Wynn talked about playing games by the rules as intended, in talking about does licking a painting count as experiencing the painting? Maybe not how the painter intended, right? So maybe we'll return to that in a little bit.
Can I think this is a really interesting topic. So two things. The first thing is what are examples, maybe this is a question for listeners to share in our Discord. What are examples of games where like the wrong rule, right? Something that's just like explicitly not in the rules
Yeah.
becomes the actual rule because of the way it's been interpreted, right?
Mm,
That's like the third part. If
Yeah.
enough people interpret it one way, then that can like sort of, usurp the actual rule, and maybe that becomes like the new rule. And the first example that comes to mind is Monopoly, where
Yeah.
like people always play it wrong forever, to the point where most people maybe don't even know the actual rule, and allegedly maybe the game isn't even that bad if you play without the free parking house rule. But I don't know because I've only ever played with groups that play that way. Like what's happening with that?
Well, no, that's really interesting. And I think that actually plays into the next sort of category of rules. But I have an example I want to mention to you that I think is interesting. And I'm going back to Magic, and I'm going back to it in part because it's a living game that is iterated on so constantly and so thoughtfully. There's really good examples of changes that they make that we can point to. So, Jake, in this most recent set, there's card text that says on lots of cards, or a fair number of cards, each player sacrifices 2 creatures of their choice. Up until this set, when they would template, write down this rules text, they would say each player sacrifices 2 creatures. Okay, great. Codified rule. Each player sacrifices 2 creatures. But my speculation, I don't know this for sure, is that they added this redundant language of their choice, which the formal rules and the codified rules, if you go read the rule book, say, okay, you get to choose when you do that. But for Magic, no one reads the rule book. You just learn from someone, and then so
Right. Like
whatever is
that's
on
a
the
great
card is
example
the
of
rule
game
book.
that nobody reads the
No
rule
one knows
book
the
of.
rule book.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Whatever's on the card is the codified rules, actually. And
Right.
then you go to the website, and then that's the second version. And then the third version is the rule book, whatever. So they changed it, I think, because there were so many people maybe at kitchen table Magic misinterpreting what each player sacrifices a creature means. So they wanted to be explicit about the choice there. Each player makes their own choice about
Yeah, I
sacrificing
could
those
see
creatures.
each player sacrifice a creature maybe being interpreted as like, okay, I'll
I'll
sacrifice your
sacrifice your
biggest
creature.
creature and
Yeah.
you'll sacrifice my biggest creature
Yeah.
or whatever.
Exactly. Yeah.
So that doesn't really, if I was how I was interpreting it, saying of their choice doesn't fix that.
Each player sacrifices 2 creatures of their own choosing. It's something like that.
But it would have to say like their own creature.
It
Anyway,
makes it explicit,
I
but I got
I
you.
see what you're saying. I see what
Yeah.
you're saying. Okay, last thing on this, I wanted to bring up on codified rules, just
Okay.
because literally last night, this came up in a little game session I had, which is sort of this idea that we have come to some sort of like consensus around the things that we need to put in rule books and things that we don't need to put in rule
Yeah.
books, and it's really jarring when a game breaks from that norm.
Yeah.
So right, nobody's gonna write down like you can't like take another player's money by force in this game,
Sure.
because we all know that, right?
You can't reach across the
um
table. Yeah.
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 So anyway, I was we were learning out of the rulebook a game called Milkuro. It's a little small box Japanese card game,
Okay.
kind of like a trick taking game. And the rulebook was like, deal each player, 15 cards in such a way that those cards will belong only to that player. And it's like, okay, just you could just say like deal the cards, and then it would say like, like take those cards, in such a way that nobody else at the table can like see the cards. Like this will be considered your hand, or so it's just funny, right? Like kind of doing
Totally.
all that stuff that from an abstract point of view, or an objective point of view rather, that makes more sense. From an objective point of view, like that is a superior rule book. It's making things more
Yes.
clear to more people than our standard rule book of like deal 15 cards to each player.
Yeah.
Okay, now next rule. Because but we've sort of like have a consensus around like, we believe that people who will buy this game like understand like this
Yeah.
much about it. And so but it's funny when that's probably not always the case.
No one writes in the rule book that I can't set up a mirror behind Jake's hand while we're playing poker. But
Yeah.
we both know I'd be cheating if I did that.
Right,
Right?
exactly.
Yeah. There are more types of rules that kind of get into that, which I think obviously maybe we're not going to get through all these in this episode.
Maybe we
That's okay.
will.
Maybe we will.
Let's plow ahead.
Okay. Next, so that was a whole conversation on formal rules, which are the designer's intended rules, the codified rules, and the interpreted rules. All 3 of those things are the formal rules of the game. Then there's internal rules. Internal rules they're internal from the perspective of the players, right? So these are rules that the players have taken on, shared or otherwise, to modify the game in some way. These are rules, right? We come up with some sort of rule. Maybe it's maybe these are house rules. Maybe this is I'm going to speed run this game under these constraints for a video game.
Yeah.
Or maybe it's
Or I was gonna
what?
say we have like 30 minutes, so we all are gonna play really fast.
Yeah, right. Yeah, totally. You only have if someone can say a 5-syllable word before your turn is over, your turn is done, or something. Yeah, that could be an internal rule that you take on. Um, so these we've talked about this sort of before on the show, and how even some players will come up with internal rules that they might or might not disclose to their play group as a way of making the game easier or more difficult, usually more difficult for themselves to create a more even play experience, right? We touched on this some in the Richard Garfield playing on hard mode episode, where we talked about one player might take on rules to give everyone at the table a better experience. And then them not disclosing that rule could also, to everyone else, might then create this weird social dynamic where other people feel bad if they discover that you have an internal rule. If they know that you're not going to buy any gold in Dominion and you're still going to beat them, that might be fine. But if you don't tell them and then you beat them and then you tell them, that could feel really bad, because internal rules are a way in which you as the player are either changing the rules just for yourself, or you as a player group are changing the rules of the game to and somehow modify the experience that's presented.
That's interesting. What are I feel like there's gray area here around like is it are we still thinking of things that are like hard and fast, or like I'm going to try to focus on this strategy this game?
If you
Is would
say,
that be like an internal rule?
I think so, if you stick to it, right? If you say, okay, I'm just going to talk about Magic all day. That's fine, I guess. You're going to play a draft of Magic the Gathering and you sit down at the
Such a
table.
useful example.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you just say, I'm going to play green.
Yeah.
I will only pick green cards out of all the packs that are passed to
So
me in this
that's a
draft.
hard rule. But if you
But
sit
that's an
down and you're like,
internal rule.
right, I know, but I'm saying like that definitely would be
Yeah.
that makes sense because that's like a hard and fast thing. But if you're like sit down and you're like, I really want to play green and I'm gonna
Mm,
like nudge those up,
yeah.
but okay, but there's no good green cards at all here. So in this pack I'm fine with like foregoing that rule.
Well, I think that's an interesting question. It depends on, I think that would depend on who you asked about the internal rules. So there's this quote
Yeah.
from Bernard de Coven, who's this cool game theorist, who I think influenced a lot of the people writing about games today. And I'm going to read you a quote from him because he'll answer your question. So, games are social fictions. This is Bernard de Coven. Games are social fictions like works of art, which exist only as long as they are continuously created. The rules are up for discussion. They are in the process of becoming through the act of play, and thus the internal rules enacted by the players cannot be ignored. I don't know that I even totally agree with this statement, but from Bernard de Coven's perspective, Jake, absolutely yes, right? And even if you changed halfway through, you said, "Oh, I don't want to do that strategy anymore."
Yeah.
Bernard de Coven would say, yes, you were following internal rules set by yourself. And I think the answer is kind of yes, right? If you sit
Yeah.
down and say, this game, I want to try to do animals in Castles
Right.
of Burgundy,
I
you've
think that
added
makes sense.
a decisional internal rule for yourself that has changed, impacted how you're looking at the decisions when you're
Or
making these
even
value judgments. Yeah.
right, like often we talk about like heuristics, right? The things that allow us to like shortcut really complex decisions in games to get to a decision easier
Yep.
by saying things like, the mine is the best tile in the first round in Castles of Burgundy. And I think in some ways it makes sense that like following a heuristic really strictly is an
Mm.
internal rule because that's not stated anywhere. But
No,
it's something that you've sort of like come to as a player. It's going to guide your play.
this is an incredible point because I once heard someone discussing their experience of playing Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is a famous classic Euro game that allows you to sort of draft these actions from a sort of group that you can take. And they hadn't played a lot of Puerto Rico, and everyone who they were playing with had played a lot of Puerto Rico. And they got to their turn, maybe they were the first or second player, and they went to take an action, and the group at the table said, "Oh, you can't do that. That's not allowed." And they said, "What do you mean I can't do that?" And they said, that's not how you play. That's not the opening book of this game, right? In the same way that chess has an openings, this play group sort of said, no. This is, everyone knows in Puerto Rico, the first player does this, the second player does this, and then the third player actually gets to make a decision. So that group had decided on a shared internal rule that had then created sort of this conflict. But I think that's interesting, right? That group really felt strongly that would lead to a better play experience for everyone.
Right. That's their house rule
That's their house rule.
in that way. It's
Yeah.
just based on this heuristic they'd created.
Yep. And maybe they wouldn't even call it a house rule. They might even just call it you're being a poor player if you choose differently and tell themselves that. But it's a house rule.
Right. Right. Yeah. It's super fascinating.
Yeah.
All right. So what's next?
I think one interesting thing here, Jake, that I want to pick up on is slightly just internal rules in board games versus video games. Just slightly. Because sometimes in these episodes we pull out further, we just talk about games a little bit more generally.
Yeah.
And video games have really rigid formal rules, right? In some ways. They're not perfect. The designer intent could be different than the codified rules, how the game's actually coded. And then how we interpret the rules, usually the interpretation of a video game is it's tough. You're just interpreting what the game will let you do versus reading an actual rule book. You might be not understand how the game works, but I think that in some ways I find as board gamers, because of our desire, because we have to interpret so much when we're reading those codified rules, a lot of us end up feeling like internal rules, whether they be house rules or otherwise, are sort of this, oh, we don't do that. Right? You're messing with the intent of the game. That's not go there. And it depends on the group. But I think for
Yeah.
me, I have only so little time to play a game. When I'm designing my own games, I'm fine with changing the rules willy-nilly. But when I play someone else's game, I want to play their intended rules. Whereas I feel like when I've played video games, there's this much more sort of free form, engage with the game how you want to engage with the game sort of spirit about it. Even for the point of, I mentioned speed running earlier, but even I'll go to a fighting game tournament and people will put
Yeah.
their own
That's what I was
internal
thinking
rules.
too.
I'm only going to play with a low tier, which is then
Or
based on what everyone thinks that
well,
is.
how about like Smash Bros, right? Where it's like,
Random only.
yeah, there's all these like crazy fun zany maps in the
Yeah.
game.
Yeah.
But actually the real game is like you only use like these 5 stages because they don't have hazards.
Totally.
And that's, and that's how we like actually play
Play
this.
this, which is an internal rule
Right.
to that group.
Right. It's
Yeah.
for the competitive community,
Sure.
not
Yeah.
yeah, which is a rule that I like to adopt too. I think you're right that by and large the video game community has much less aversion to fudging with rules than the board game community. I wonder if that's just because of how rigid the structure is, like because we can just do anything with a board game so easily
Yeah.
that we're sort of collectively being like, oh, that's like a slippery slope if we start messing with stuff. Where like a video game, unless you're like a coder, right, and you're like getting in and messing up the physics of the game or modding it or whatever, you can only really like take it so far
Yeah.
because like the game will at a certain point fight you. A board game will never fight you.
Yeah. I think it totally. And I think another part of it is there's another little excerpt that I want to read, and then we'll move on, I promise. But this is, a formalist might argue that a player who has adopted internal rules is not playing the same game as their fellow players. We might be formalists based on
What is a
what's being said here.
formalist?
A formalist is right, someone who is taking on this sort of formal perspective. That someone who
Okay.
takes on internal rules is not playing the same game as their fellow players. So a formalist is also known as a rules layer, right?
Okay. Yeah.
That's a joke.
Well, okay. So like so that would be like saying if we choose to play on hard mode, then we're not playing the same game as our opponent. I would disagree with that.
And a formalist would argue that you are not playing as the same game.
I'm not a
But
formalist.
right, yeah. Okay, great. But and
Okay.
then they say, well, this idealist reading is valid. It does not change that in practice, the transgressive player, so the person playing by an internal rule, is interacting with fellow players within the confines of what is socially recognized as the same game. This is all to
Right.
say, I think the reason as board gamers why we often tend to err towards not wanting internal rules if they're not at least agreed upon in the beginning is because it's easier to identify when someone is playing by an internal rule, because you sort of have a more immediate relationship both with the game in a board game and with the other players at the table. Whereas with video games, I am less immediately connected to the rules because they're enforced themselves. I didn't have to learn them and codify them in my brain in the same way. I can experience them and codify them through play. And I'm typically not next to the person I'm playing the game with, so it's harder for me to figure out. Or I'm interacting in a different social space. If I'm playing, I don't know, Halo, right? We're all over the map. I'm not always going to know this player's decided they're only going to use melee attacks and embarrass everyone in the room because I'm not going to interact with them. Whereas in board games, I can see, Jake,
Well,
why are you taking the suboptimal action every time? It's still beating
not
us.
if not always. If there's like hidden cards, you know, it could be very similar.
It could
Like,
be.
oh,
It could
I'm
be.
discarding these strong cards out of
Sure.
my hand or
Sure.
something.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, that's really interesting. I think I think I'm of the opinion that a person playing by their own set of informal rules is
Internal
still
rules. Yeah.
playing internal rules. Sorry,
That's
is still
okay.
playing the same game as somebody else playing in that
I
game.
think so
They
too.
just might be messing with the social contract
Yeah.
in a way that is not always great.
As long as they're
I
not
think,
cheating to do it.
yeah. We've talked about house rules a little bit before in this podcast, and I feel like we tend to come down on like defenders of house ruling games
Yeah.
more so. Like people
Yeah.
tend to, I feel like in our hobby, that is tended to look down upon. The more I design games,
Yeah.
and I realize I get to the point in designing a game where I'm like,
All rules
if
are
I do
made up.
this, some people will like it more.
Yeah.
If I do this
Yeah.
other thing, some other people will like it more. And then you realize like the games in front of us are exactly the same, right?
Yeah.
I want to like experience it once
Yeah.
the way it was written, and then I'm totally happy to tweak away. Or it's even be enough for me like if a friend brings a game over and they're like, I played this, but I think it's better like this. That's enough for me to say, all right, let's do it the fun way.
Yeah.
You know?
I think it also for me depends on the length of the game. If it's a shorter game, I'm more interested because then I can play it multiple times and change. Like I just want to learn, right? Let's
Yeah,
be honest. When I'm playing games, I'm learning. I don't know. Okay, should we keep going? That was
yeah.
internal
Let's keep
rules. The
internal rules.
the rules we take on as players or as a group
All
of
right,
players. Okay,
what's next?
the next type of rules that govern playing games are not formal rules. They're not internal rules. They're the social rules that we put on the
Here
game
we
playing
go.
space itself. So I want to start with this really fascinating soccer example or,
Love it.
football example, global football,
Yes.
not American football. Okay. So Jake, this is an excerpt, but at the very end of extra time in 2010 quarterfinal football match between Uruguay and Ghana, Uruguay's Luis Suarez stopped the ball from entering the goal with his hands. Okay? This is not the goalie. It's just another player who reached out the last second and just
I think our
tended
listeners
the
know
goal
who
with a
Luis
hand.
Suarez is.
Okay, I hope so. Do you?
Yeah.
Okay, I don't. By doing
I
so,
just
not ironically.
I'm sure most people probably don't,
But
unless you're
some
like
do.
soccer. This was like I remember this
You remember this
happening.
moment?
Like
Okay,
this was
cool.
in the World Cup. This was like a huge
A
thing.
huge deal. Okay, so by
Yeah.
doing so, he stopped Ghana from scoring a goal, and the referee handed Suarez a red card and awarded Ghana not a goal, a penalty kick. So he's following the rules of the game. The penalty kick failed, so the rule violation played off. Ultimately, Uruguay won that game. So the player who blocked the ball in a penalty shootout. So here's the question: was it acceptable for Suarez to follow the actual rules of the game, intentionally committing a foul, willingly accepting a penalty, or was it somehow morally wrong or not within the rules of the game? Was he not following the real rules of the game doing
Yeah.
that?
For me, I think this comes down to kind of your a nuanced understanding of like is violating a rule in soccer cheating,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And I think that people would have like different opinions on that. But I think like in the world of professional sports, like getting a penalty, like doing something that has like a negative association with it is not exactly the same as cheating, if that makes sense. And therefore in this case, I don't think that this player was what was it violating? What was the actual question? The
Uh
terminology?
I think it was, were they morally wrong
Yeah,
of
I don't think
intentionally violating a
this is
rule?
such a hard question.
It's
It's like feels like not super ethical. However, in basketball, if somebody's running free and they're going to get an easy layup,
yeah.
slapping them from behind so that they have to shoot 2 free throws, it happens.
It's a standard feature of the game.
Yeah, it happens 20 times a game.
Hack a
You know,
Shack.
and
It's a strategy.
right in soccer, players are constantly fouling each other. Right,
Yeah.
you're grabbing each other, pulling them back. They're running off sides to like get past the defense, and if they get away with it, great. If they don't get away with it, like there's a rule in place for that. So I
Sure.
think in this case, it's all within the structure of allowed play.
But do
Uh,
you want to watch soccer at the World Cup where every time someone takes a shot on goal, any player who's nearby tries to block it with their hand so that then the other team is forced to take a penalty kick and that player gets a red card and then they're kicked out of the game? Because that's the type of soccer that was played. Is that a better version of soccer for everyone involved? Players,
that would
sports,
never
coaches.
happen because that player gets a red card and is sent out of the game,
Great.
right? It's like
Just have a
something that
big.
could only happen at the very end of the game, right? And then in
Are
which
you down a
case,
player or do you just get to sub in
yeah,
next
you're
guy?
down, you're
You're down
out
a
of the
player.
game. So now you're
Okay.
playing one person less. So you try
Okay.
that again. Now you're down two
Two
people.
players.
It's
Yeah.
not going to work out for you as a strategy.
Okay.
Um, I, I mean, it could. Is it morally wrong? Maybe yes. Does it violate the rules of the game? Definitely yes. Is it? And yet, like, I don't know. Like,
Yeah.
what's? Yeah,
We're
I don't.
this is great, right? This is this whole idea, right? Social rules.
Yeah. There's another example would be like in I play in recreational kickball leagues,
Yeah.
and in baseball they have like a infield fly rule
Yeah.
where if somebody hits the ball real high up into the air and it's going to be in the infield, the player is automatically out,
Yep.
and that is to prevent a situation where the players running the base uh, have no good option, because if they leave the base, then the person catches the ball and they have to return to the base, right? Because they didn't like tag up. But if they don't leave the base, then the person can simply let the ball drop and get a double play a different way.
Mm.
In kickball, you don't have that rule. So like the standard norm of decency is like you don't do that. But I've seen people do that exact thing to
Yeah.
like get kind of an unearned double play in like
So
a
there's an
moment.
internal rule, but
It's like, yeah, it's like a hand, like the, yeah, right, the actual intended, the formal rule is like that is a totally legal play.
yeah. But the reason why it's a
The
social rule,
right is
it,
because people tend to not do it.
and because we follow social rules because we care about what other people think about us in
Yeah,
some ways, right?
right. So it's like, to go back to the soccer thing, it's like the exact same thing as that,
Yeah.
right? Like the, and it's essentially like breaking the magic circle of a social rule in a like extremely high profile, high
High
stakes
stakes
way.
moment. Yeah.
Do you-
And I will add, I think that this is among the most interesting rules laid out in this book, right? This area of sort of exploring, because so much of the culture of games, sort of the way in which we as people exist and play games and talk about games with people who maybe don't often play games as hobbyists, has to do with the values that as a culture we put on playing games. And actually, a lot of playing games and learning to play games as we grow up are learning a set of ethics and values on which we can share these social rules that supposedly makes game playing better for all of us. Maybe in that instance, Suarez didn't feel like it was, so he broke the social rule that you don't do that because he wanted to win a World Cup, because he spent his whole life trying to win a World Cup, right? But we have all this language around this, right, Jake? Playing fair, following the spirit of the rules, being a good sport. All of those are referring to social rules that we've set, right? What does it mean to play fair? What does it mean to be a
yeah,
good sport?
I think that's all right and all correct, and also like it doesn't necessarily translate at like the highest levels of professional
Sure.
sports where people say things like, if you're not cheating, you're not trying,
Yeah.
and and you are supposed to do everything that you possibly can to win, and you're not there to make friends,
Yeah.
right? The social rule, like the consequence of that
Yeah.
is that you like don't get invited back to game night,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? But
So there's a social consequence for breaking social rules.
right, and Suarez is not going to be welcomed in.
But maybe you also don't get the cleat deal.
Right, maybe you don't get the cleat deal. Maybe you never
Yeah.
go to that continent again in
Yeah.
your life.
Sure. Yeah.
But did he break the formal rule, right?
Yeah.
No,
Yep.
right? He did not. And so I think that's kind of like where it falls down a little bit in sports.
Yeah.
Do you think that's the same or different from the more famous handball incident in World Cup history?
What's that
Do you
one?
know about the
Please
Hand
regale
of
me.
God? It's called the
No.
Hand of God.
What happened?
It's a player named Diego Maradona
I
jumped
do
up
know
to
Maradona. Okay, go on.
okay, jumped up to head the ball into the
Oh,
goal
sure.
in the World Cup, uh, and as he jumps, he lifts his hand,
Oh,
and as he swings forward, it's out of reach, but he hits it with his hand, goes in. He acts like he headed it in,
yeah.
and in reality, it was he scored with the handball, totally illegal. But
Did the
back
referee
then they
see
didn't
it?
have VR. No, like the referee couldn't
Wow.
see it, or whatever. It ended up counting. Um,
Wow.
that feels more cheating-y, right? It's like you cheated on purpose and didn't get the consequence. Where Suarez, you cheat on purpose, you got the consequence. Like the rule as intended happened.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that I don't know. I feel like there's slight difference between those two things.
I think so too. I do think in your second example, Jake, it's very clear that Maradona broke a formal rule of the game. He just didn't
Right.
get the rules
Well, they both
weren't
broke the rule that you can't touch with your hand. In one case, it was penalized. In the other case, it wasn't.
wasn't. Yeah, right. Yes. In one game, the this doesn't quite map to our language, right? But we rely on officials within sports or other
Right.
games, Magic the Gathering in a tournament, to enforce the rules of the game. And a feature of both board games and sports that video games don't share is the sort of issues with enforcing rules. So
Yeah.
yeah, the
But
formal rules weren't enforced. So
But having said that, like we would never accept that at our game night, right? Like if somebody
no,
like stole coins from like the bank and they were caught,
you're
it
done.
wouldn't be like enough to be like, oh, now you have to like pay those back with a penalty.
Right.
It'd be like, don't ever come
Don't
back to game
cheat.
night.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Like, what are you
right.
doing?
We're
Yeah.
Yeah. So
We
I
don't
think
do
that
that.
just is right. So anyway, turns out the world of professional sports at the highest level is not exactly the same as our dining room tables at game night,
Yeah.
but we should still try not to be jerks.
And I think these social rules are really important because there's other factors that come into play, right? We talk about this in board games all the time. This comes up in this very episode or this very podcast frequently. How long is socially acceptable to take to play your game? That's a
Right.
social rule, right? Analysis paralysis is a real thing. And we all kind of co-enforce this. And Jake, in this section, they talk some about, is it even possible to have a rule book that captures all the rules of play, which you alluded to earlier, right? Um, no rule book says you can't hit your friend in the face while you're playing. You can't tear up a card if you don't like what it says. You can't set up a mirror, like I said.
I
Um,
like to just scream at the top of my lungs the whole time anyone else is taking a turn.
right. You're not breaking a formal rule. It's not an internal rule. You're just breaking a social rule that we use our inside voices, as I say to my toddler all the time.
I think one thing I'm struggling with here is like different things matter differently in different settings. I think I was kind of thinking like in that soccer example, like almost trying to like, well, this is the least important of the types of rules in this setting. And
mm,
this, right? Like, okay, well, obviously formal rule, that must be like the most important type of rule.
mm. Now you're
But
feeling like
in a lot
social rules.
but now I feel like they all
Oh,
must be like kind of somehow equally or differently applied because there are certain social rules, of course, that would
the foundation on which we've built our game playing culture.
our whole society, right?
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
we're not, like if we're like start like doing physical harm to other players in the game,
yeah.
then that is something I would put more importance upon than the designer's intent of Castles of Burgundy.
100%.
Yeah,
Yeah. But at the end of the day, those rules probably are more important to having that sort of fair, there we go back to that word again, that fair game playing experience, right? That we
right.
all kind of, as game playing humans, agree upon.
And the challenge with these ones is that like you can't really write them down as formal rules. That's what you're saying. We might not all
Yeah.
necessarily interpret the same social rules in every setting.
Yeah.
Yeah, Suarez thought it was fine to handball the ball.
Yeah. Yeah. And they won, right? So I don't
Yeah,
know. He probably still feels it was a good choice. Yeah. This is again, Jake, where they explore some. You should, if you're curious about what I said earlier about how licking the side of a painting, does that sort of count, quote unquote, as experiencing? If you lick the edge of Starry Night, can you really say to someone you engaged with Starry Night as Van Gogh intended? I think no, right? I think most people would argue no, that you can't say you know you've actually engaged with Starry Night as intended if you did that. But you have had an encounter with Starry Night. So they explore
You've
that some in
engaged
this
with it,
chapter.
that's for sure.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, communed with Starry Night. Yeah, and then they also in this chapter, Jake, explore some, and they being the authors of the rule book. Again, we're pulling very heavily on this book. Talk about social rules in board games and how we have a lot of social rules in board games. And they sort of speak to this, and I think it really rings true. There was a study of social rules in board games by Carl Bergstrom in 2010 that explored social rules of experienced board gamers, and his whole goal was just like I want to try to find as many of the implicit social rules that exist in board games as possible. So I'm going to read some of these, and you
Love
can
it.
nod if you agree. Every player must attempt to optimize their position in the game on every turn.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty. That like play to win.
I mean, I think yeah, that's like
That's the
play. You have to
Knizia
like
quote, right?
the Knizia thing. You have to like meaningfully engage with like the goal of winning the game.
Winning isn't the point, but it
Yeah,
is the objective.
yeah,
Even if this means pretending you have a chance of winning, right? So players should not terminate the game early, even if their position will only deteriorate, and they shouldn't just leave the game before it's concluded. And I think that's true. When was the last time you conceded a game night table in which three other people were having a fun game? You knew you'd lost. Did you get up
yeah.
and leave?
With the caveat that like I think it's fine to concede in a 2-player game.
Sure, but yeah, right.
Yeah,
That's
but
a
yeah, we're talking multiplayer games. Then yeah, I
yeah.
think you don't yeah ruin everyone else's fun.
Players are
Suck it up.
don't ruin everyone else's fun. So players are expected. This is one of the rules pulled out of this study. Players are expected to adhere to the spirit of the game, not whine about the game or their position, not gloat or sulk excessively after the game is concluded. Be a good sport.
Yeah, I think that's fair
What
as
about this
a
one?
notorious gloater and sulker.
Players not
I know
avenged.
it's wrong to do that.
Sure. But you probably do it jokingly in a way that feels like it's not
Right.
breaking a social rule.
Right.
You're
Yeah,
probably not like, Jared, you are
that's so
such a numbskull.
right,
And
it's
reading it.
interesting.
Yeah.
In some ways, like, it can be, like, a way to, like, flex our, like, social acuity to be like, "I'm
Sure.
so aware of this social rule that I can, like, make
Dance
fun of
around
it."
it. Yeah,
Yeah.
totally. 100%. How about this one? Players must not avenge the deeds of past games and not engage in metagaming, such as collaboration between spouses or threatening out of game consequences. Jake, if you move that piece into the final exhibit, I'm not going to drive you home.
There's a word for it in fantasy football is, like, colluding, right? You can't do
Yeah.
anything outside of this that would break the spirit of the game.
Yep.
I think the metagaming one is much more difficult to say for sure.
Sure.
The Game Brain podcast talks about this a lot, right?
Yeah.
And I think they would say that they aren't. So they have a group of people that always plays together, right? And they talk about kind of the dynamics of their game group on their podcast. Recommend it if you haven't heard of it. And I think what they would say is that they're posturing like based on not necessarily like I'm going to punish you for because you did this last game or whatever. But it's like I have to demonstrate that if I make a threat, I'm going to carry it out because if I get a reputation as somebody who's like reneges on their threats, right?
Mm.
And in that way, they might do something that hurts their situation in this current game to improve their table image as like a trustworthy or like person not to screw over in a future play.
Carl Bergstrom in the study had you covered, Jake, because he also concludes that rules vary from group to group, and each group has to address and handle these issues, such as taking back a move, figuring out how long one can take to make a move, managing deals and cooperation, handling rules arbitration cases, like penalty for breaking the rules, right? And sanctioning the transgressions of social rules. Every group has to figure out what their own group social rules would be. So Game Brain has slightly different social rules than some, but we all have these sort of nuanced social rule cultures in which every game we play as a group exists. And I think that's important, right? If we're talking about the rules of a game, that's part of the rules of the games we play.
What about eating Cheetos? We can all agree that's not the right thing to do.
If they're sleeved and you throw away the sleeves after. Bougie. Jake, can I tell a quick anecdote?
Yeah,
I was playing my
please.
first Keyforge tournament ever. You and I both love Keyforge. It's how we met, playing that Richard Garfield game. I was so excited. I was having just a great time. I was like, oh, everyone here is just into Keyforge. We're going to have a fun time. I was doing pretty well. And I ended up matched up fairly late in the tournament against a player who made a mistake. And I thought, the game literally released this weekend. I'll let you take it back. And I thought in that moment, we had created a social rule that within our game, the spirit of the game we were playing was that if someone, right when they made a decision, regretted it, that they could undo it, right? I thought we did. So towards the end
I
of the
know where this is
game,
going.
I made a mistake that where the second I said it, I declared the wrong house. I literally just said Logos or whatever, and I should have said Dis. And the second I said it, I realized it, and I go, "Oh, actually, I mean." And he goes, "Actually," and this is not an internal rule we created, right? It was a social rule I thought existed that did not, because he said, "Well, Brendan, the formal rules of the game do not allow you to change your house." And then, smashed me and moved on to the finals of the tournament. And that moment felt so bad because to me, as a game player in that moment,
Yeah.
it felt as bad, really, as if he had broken a formal rule.
Yeah. Informal rule. I'll propose a new one. That person is fired into the sun by rocket.
I just remember turning
If
like,
you like willingly accept the good grace of your opponent and then like use that against them in the future, like you go to the sun.
my friend who was at the tournament with me just put their hand on my shoulder because they could tell I was like having a moment, and they were like, "It's okay."
that's
Then
that's just so like unmitigatingly
you
awful
know
way
that
to behave as a person.
you know the plastic amber tokens, the special ones that they used to hand out at tournaments, the non-cardboard ones?
Yeah,
Clearly this person felt bad because they got 3 of those, 3 little piddly ambers. These are something for people who don't play Keyforge that maybe you have 30 of in your kit or whatever.
that's
And they're like, I know I get to move on, but you can have my amber." And then gave me 3 pieces of plastic. I was like,
I
throw it in their
you should
face.
not have you should not have accepted that. Did
Right?
you?
Like, no, I don't think I did.
You can't let somebody like weasel out of their guilt in that
Totally.
way, right? Because that person was probably like fair exchange.
Yep. Yeah. So that's my
You get something, I get something.
yeah. It's really this
What
is what we
that's
go to
so
though about magic circles, right? Part of every magic circle is not just making sure we all understand the formal rules of a game or that we're all playing by the same internal rules, is that we all have a pretty good sense of all the social rules and then also what will happen if a social rule is misunderstood by a player. That's a
the
really
interesting
important
thing
part of playing
too
games.
is like all of these things get so much more stark as soon as there's any kind of stakes,
Yeah.
right?
Oh,
Because
100%.
right, so like even it's like an informal tournament like that or whatever. Like I've done a bunch of Keyforge tournaments, and it's like because it's a quote unquote competitive setting.
Yeah.
Like anytime something goes wonky with the Magic Circle, like if you were just playing a casual game of Keyforge against that person, you could just stop and say like, "Hey, like that makes me feel bad because of like when I let you take that back." So I think like I thought you would like extend me the same grace. I
Yeah.
think that would be fair. And then maybe still don't invite that person over to play keyboard again in the
Yeah.
future or whatever.
Yeah.
But like in the tournament, right? You can't really do that
Yeah.
in the same way. Yeah,
Interestingly, I was curious in working on the notes for this episode, Jake. I wondered what the rules on slow play were for Magic the Gathering. Because in tournaments, right, you can't just take forever. You have to kind of keep a pace of play. So I looked it up, and it says players must take their turns in a timely fashion, regardless of the complexity of the play situation, and adhere to time limits specified for the tournament. Players must maintain a pace to allow the match to be finished in the announced time. Stalling is not acceptable. Players may ask a judge to watch their game for slow play. Such a request will be granted if feasible. So this is basically saying, just the rules, just follow the rules. And if you don't think the other person's following the rules, just call a judge and they'll decide if they're following the rules. Because even in a high-ish stakes like Magic, the formal rules can't capture the nuance that social
yeah.
rules allow. And because social rules with stakes don't work, we need someone to arbitrate the decisions. And I think that's a really fascinating thing about games.
I I think what's happening here is that the social rules, as we've discussed ad nauseum, can't be codified in the same way that formal rules can, and they have a direct impact on the actual outcome of the game,
Yeah.
right? Because Suarez handballed the ball tactically, right?
Yes.
Your opponent chose when it would be acceptable to allow a formal rule to
Yep.
be broken and when it wouldn't in a way that suited them. And the same with slow play, right? If a round is an hour and one person uses an unfair amount of that based on whatever, who knows.
Yeah.
45 minutes, leaving the other person only 15 minutes to think. Right, that's why they have chess clocks in chess tournaments, and we don't always have those in board games. Not that I'm advocating for that. That's why this gets so messy, is because the social rules actually directly impact the outcome of the game. It's not just what foods are appropriate to eat, like how much time to play, which could be like maybe make the gameplay less fun. But yeah, all of a sudden there's stakes, and the outcome is also kind of in the balance of these.
I think this also helps explain why teaching kids to play t-ball is really hard, because you're trying to teach the formal rules of the game and the social rules of game playing all at the same time, right? There's a lot for someone whose brain is still developing and maybe is 4 or 5 to learn. And a huge part of why growing up coaches spend all this time talking about etiquette and norms and ideals and ethics is because all of our game playing, we must agree, right? Because this culture exists, is made better through us having a shared set of social rules. And one of my social rules is just play so that to maximize fun in some ways, right? And I think that's a pretty common one. But this is just interesting. This is social rules. They really matter. We can do the last two really fast. What do you
Let's
think?
do them. Yeah.
Okay,
Because I don't know if we'll have enough for a whole nother episode, so it's okay to just
we'll
go long.
power through.
Sometimes people are like, why don't you guys just go longer than an hour?
Yeah, well, because of the social rule between Jake and I that this podcast is an hour.
Because we normally record on lunch break.
Yeah, there you go. External rules. So this is the fourth type of rule that exists as identified in the rules of play. And it's just the external rules that exist within the world. This to me is the least interesting, but it's worth mentioning. So this is the law. You have to follow the law in designing the games that you can play. And I don't think that's actually true necessarily. You could make an illegal game. I just don't think you'd have a lot of players. But then another one is everyone has to consent to play the game, which I do think is a really important external rule that exists, right? A game stops being a game if the external rule of players consent to play games is broken. It's not a game anymore unless you say you want to play. And on
This
some
reminds
level,
me of
consent. Some people get pressured, but
Yeah. Yeah, this reminds me of the play at work presentation in that
uh,
episode we talked about,
yeah,
where like play at work leads to all these benefits for a workplace in terms of like good organizational citizenship behavior,
yeah,
better problem solving, all this type of stuff that organizations want, unless the play is mandatory, in which case you get the inverse. You get like
yes,
really
yeah,
negative outcomes. So it's interesting riff on that, if we're making the case that in fact that's because if consent is not offered, you're actually not playing a game. You're working.
yes, yeah. No, totally. And then I do think this other part, the law, part of the reason this matters, right, is the social context in which we play games matters, right? The cultural context matters and the legal context matters, because if we all want to follow the law when we play, that means in countries where the country has rules about in gambling, let's say games of luck versus games of skill, that impacts the types of games that can exist and the types of games that can be played for stakes, which really in some level does affect the types of games that culturally can be prominent. And if you are more curious about that, you should really seek out this book and read this chapter more, because I don't think Jake and I will have too much more to say about it, but the rule book does, and Jaco Sternos and Marcus Montola have more to say about it. So it's interesting.
The only other thing I want to say about that is I think play could still happen in a repressive regime or situation. Like
Yeah,
if you were in a jail and they say you're not allowed to play chess, and you
sure,
like find a way to like play mental chess or something.
sure.
Like in that case, you're not following the law, but I think you're still
You're
playing.
still playing the game. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So anyway,
totally. Okay. The final sort of type of rule within the 5 types of rules are material rules. And this is a really cool one, right? So this is calling back to what I said at the beginning about the thing that sort of impacts all the rules we could ever make. Because this is this idea that there are laws that govern existence. Games are shaped by the material world, right? No, Jenga doesn't in the rule book say that these rules are intended for Earth, but good luck playing Jenga on the International Space Station, right?
Jenga in space.
Jenga in space doesn't work. No, it
No, but
doesn't
we
work.
could design it. Could that be our kind of like niche?
NASA, if you're out there, Jake and I are
Yeah.
interested in a fellowship to make dexterity games in space using objects already on the International Space Station. So just this is completely
That's a
sincere.
pitch.
If you are listening, we are here. please reach out. So, Jake, there's another, and someone might be like, okay, that's one example you have. Here's another really interesting anecdote from the book, Jake. Games with bouncing balls couldn't exist in Europe before rubber was brought from South America in the 1500s. So in Europe, before the 16th century, when the first Aztec rubber balls were brought from Mesoamerica, just the material rules of the world were such that games with bouncing balls in the way that we know them couldn't exist, right?
Yeah,
So
that's really
our
interesting for
physical world, yeah.
like app integrated games,
Yeah.
right? Those are things that like we just like could not have had
Yeah.
prior to whatever.
Or even, the practicality of digital printing and the different types of games that you can print versus when you had to print. And this is way too in the weeds, but there are different types of printers, right? And some printers can only print at this huge scale, so the material world made it more difficult for certain types of games to exist, and which then other types of printers make it possible. There's this whole world, and then there's other things like the 10 count in boxing, Jake. So the body in some ways also acts as a material embodiment of the rules, because almost all rules on Earth presuppose that human beings are playing those rules, right? Like the rules of Jenga are written assuming that a human being is playing.
Adding that to every rule book I ever write. Like this game is primarily for human beings on Earth.
Yeah, species typical possibilities, right? And there's no standard human body. That just has to be
Right.
said right now at this point, right? There's no standard human body. But the game rules tend to presuppose certain things about human beings and human bodies that imply sort of an ideal player. And in some games, right, like in swimming, one of the reasons Michael Phelps is so amazing is hands are giant, so it makes him a really good swimmer. Other
Yeah.
reasons too, but like boxing is this really interesting game governed by the material rules of the world, because there's a rule that if you get knocked out and you can't stand up after a 10 count, you're just out. So that's about what your body, your physical body, can take as being a part of the rules of the game.
I'm having flashbacks to when we talked about is the game of basketball an asymmetric game because one team has a 7-foot person and the other team
Yeah.
doesn't.
Yeah. No, totally. And I think some people might be saying, "Oh yeah, you're kind of in the weeds." But this matters in other contexts too, right? So, have you ever heard of the documentary The King of Kong, Jake? It's about the
Yeah, oh
chasing,
yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Love
chasing
that.
Donkey
That
Kong world
what a
record.
what a go watch that movie if you haven't seen it. What
Kill
a
screen
film.
coming up. I think there's movies
I haven't seen
now.
it in forever, so I hope it holds up, but
There's definitely academic papers written about documentaries about that documentary, because it does a lot of interesting things from a narrative storytelling perspective. But anyway, within the sort of frame of this documentary, it's about someone trying to get the world record in Donkey Kong. And it comes up that someone sort of says, "Oh, Steve Weeb, this version of your arcade cabinet, we think that it's not a good version because it has a little bit of glue on this capacitor." So what they were saying in that example, and that makes some other change in the game, right? So, and if you try to submit, I have an emulator of Donkey Kong. I broke the world record on my emulated version of Donkey Kong. The people who care about the world record for Donkey Kong would say, no, it has to be played on an original arcade board. So within this sort of cultural space, people were rules lawyering that Steve Weeb had broken a material rule by it not being an original, untampered with Donkey Kong arcade cabinet as the reason why his record didn't count as being record breaking. I think that's fascinating from a game playing
yeah.
perspective, right? Just really interesting. And somehow that same thing is also related to why Jenga doesn't work in space. And it just is, because it's all about the rules, the material rules of the world. You couldn't write a rule in your game that says release this cube, and when it flies up, wherever it lands on your ceiling dictates this aspect of the game. That's just not, we can't explore games that don't work on our material world right yet. That's cool.
That is really really interesting, and thinking about kind of how pieces like that do influence games, right? Like the fact that marathon times were basically the same, slowly decreasing, world record times, and then like a new shoe technology was invented, and now like times are like plummeting, right? Like people
Yeah.
are getting much faster since this new technology is invented, which kind of makes you think like, wait, is that what is going on with that, right? Is that even the same at a certain point? Is it the same game
Yeah.
as what was played previously, as if like technologies and things get too good? There's
Yeah.
some similar kind of weird tech thing where like professional Super Smash Bros players will like hunt for GameCube controllers that have like a certain kind of defect that makes like a specific movement in the game like a little bit more consistent
Mm,
to execute. And all of
so
these things
interesting.
that have to do with the material world and the rules of that more so than the rules of the game, and yet still influence. That's what I keep going back to, which I find so fascinating. Like, it still influences the outcome of the game in all these examples, except for the rubber bouncing ball one,
Yeah.
which just influences the existence of the
Yeah.
game
Yeah.
in the first place.
Totally. So yeah, I think you, the listener, can think of other examples in board games also, that the material world, right? The types of pieces we can even make dictate the games that we can play. But I think this was a good enough sort of deep dive into the 5 types of rules. So as a quick overview, Jake, right? We had our formal rules, what you think of as the rules of the game, the internal rules, the rules that we make up ourselves as players to play a game, maybe shared or maybe not. There are the social rules that govern the spaces in which we play games socially, and those we talked about how fundamental those are. They're the external rules, which are just the laws that govern people consenting to play. Everything outside of the game playing sphere that could impact the game playing sphere, and then material rules, sort of how the things that we play with or the planet that we play on impact the types of games we can play and what those games look like and how they're shaped.
Yeah. I thought this was a really fun episode, and it's definitely got my gears turning to really curious to discuss this on the Discord with folks. One thing that just came to mind at the very end is role playing games. Like,
Mm,
how do those games kind of interact with
yeah.
all of these things? Because I was like, well, that's kind of like a game that could exist on like not an earthly plane if you wanted to, with a whole different set of material rules that you could play with and design around. How interesting is that?
Yeah.
So I'm just curious what ideas, games, and things this episode makes people think about.
And I think for me, Jake, too, this illustrates the of how fragile, varied, and ephemeral game playing really is. There's so many factors that come into play that inform our experience of a game, even beyond our interpretation of formal rules, right? The social rules around it, all these different things. So I'm just left thinking, I know basketball in the NBA, that's basketball. Basketball that I play 5-on-5 in my backyard, that's basketball. Basketball that I play on a half a court 3v3, that feels like basketball. Horse, this looks a lot like basketball. I might say to someone, I'm going to go play basketball, but am I playing basketball? I don't even know anymore. Um, but I now have a framework of rules to explore it thanks to this awesome book. Again, the rule book, The Building Blocks of Play by Jaco Sternos and Marcus Montola, published by MIT Press. I just want to say that again. If you were intrigued by any of these topics, I encourage you to seek out this sort of academic monograph. It's a great book.
We'll
Don't
include a
expect it.
link.
It'll be dry.
Is it
What's that?
viable? I'm
Yeah,
sure
it's
it's
viable.
purchasable.
It's
Yeah,
yeah,
all right.
yeah, yeah.
We'll
We'll
link
include a
to it
link,
in our.
and it's affordable. Yeah, totally. Thank you so much. Coming up, we are gonna for our pre-planners, we're still gonna cover Castle Combo, a really light sort of synergistic, simple synergy card game, and Mexica, one of the Mass Trilogy games by Kramer and Kiesling, in upcoming episodes. So explore those if you like. Come talk to us in our Discord. Jake just alluded to it. You can find a link to it in our show notes or on decisionspacepodcast.com, where you'll find more things Decision Space. And thank you to Hembry for our intro and outro song, Reach Out. And Jake, thank you for always following the rules when we play, including the social rules and the material rules.
All right. Thanks, everyone. See you next week.
Bye, y'all.
Bye.
Closer now.